Hi, my name is Meredith Gleason, and I'm a licensed educational psychologist. I have an Instagram account called Mrs. G, the LEP. If you want to follow me for additional information I put out about children with disabilities, ways to support students with unique learning needs, parenting strategies, things like that. So I wanted to share today about ADHD. So I know Nicole asked me to talk a little bit about that. I would say, an often asked about topic when I talk to parents. So part of my job as an educational psychologist is testing children for certain disabilities such as ADHD. So I specialize in diagnosing ADHD as well as learning disorders like dyslexia. I also specialize in diagnosing anxiety and autism. So when I'm looking at a child that might have ADHD, there's a few things I'm looking for, and there's a variety of ways I test for that. I do in-person testing, like looking at how their brain processes information, how they perform academically, behaviorally, how do they perform emotional regulation? Are they able to control their feelings? Are they able to move from one thing to another? How's their attention, planning skills, memory? These are all things that can be affected by ADHD. So I'll talk a little more about that later, but I do an assessment and it leads to a diagnosis if they meet diagnostic criteria. There's certain criteria that they have to meet to say they have the disorder of ADHD. And there's different types as well that I'll talk about in just a minute. So that's one part of what I do. Another part of what I do is counseling and executive functioning coaching for students with ADHD. So counseling, I'm usually helping students learn coping strategies, emotional regulation, how to identify how they're feeling, and kind of interrupt that impulsive cycle students with ADHD often has of going from 0 to 60, and it feels like there's no breaks. So my job is to help students realize there are breaks between 0 and 60. There are signs in the middle of that 0 to 60 range where you can catch yourself, use a strategy, and become more emotionally regulated. And so that's one thing that I do, as well as executive functioning coaching. Executive functioning is helping a child with time management skills. Executive function includes learning, memory. It includes organization, controlling your emotions, flexibility, transitioning from one thing to the next. A lot of different skills that are usually stored in the front part of our brain. So if our brain is a conductor, or excuse me, or if our brain is an orchestra, it's like the conductor of our brain would be the executive functioning, and it's in the frontal lobe, the front part of our brain. For kids, or really for young adults, the executive functioning part of our brain in that frontal lobe isn't fully developed till age 25. So for any kid, it's hard to have these skills. For kids with ADHD, they're significantly impaired, and a likelihood of their brain developing that frontal lobe that they need by 25 is much lower when they have ADHD, and much more difficult. So they have to often use strategies that they learn through executive functioning coaching to help make their executive functioning in their brain at different times, whether it's organization, time management, planning, memory, task completion, all of these kind of things. So let's jump into ADHD in a nutshell. I'm going to share my screen. I have a training that I did previously on ADHD. So I'm going to go ahead and start that. So I'm going to jump into, let me go back, I apologize. I'm going to go back to what types of ADHD there are. So there are 3 different kinds. You can have ADHD inattentive type, meaning you're less likely to attend. A lot of times students that have the inattentive type may be having almost like a video playing in their head where they're kind of daydreaming and they're staring off at the wall, or they're staring off at something but you can't quite see what, or they might just kind of shake their head and be like, what did you say? They kind of tune out for periods of time. So that attention piece is challenging. It's hard for them to stay focused. Another type is having hyperactivity or impulsivity. So hyperactive means they're constantly moving, they're excessively talking, they may seem restless, constantly like an engine is running. Impulsive or impulsivity is a form of ADHD, that means they are acting without thinking. There's no stop and think, there's just go. And so they, for example, if someone were to take their pencil, their impulse might be to grab the person's arm and grab back the pencil. Or if somebody bumps into them in the hallway, their impulsivity may be to push that person, like, oh, you bumped me, or yell at them. Whereas like if we stop and think like, oh, they bumped into me, that was probably not on purpose. They said, excuse me. I should say, oh, no problem, and keep going. But my impulsive reaction is, oh, get away from me. You're in my space. Those kind of things. When people that are impulsive and have this type of ADHD, they can be quick to do things that are usually a large out of proportion to what the situation calls for. So usually the size of their reaction does not match the size of a problem. Small problems can trigger big reactions, which then can lead to larger consequences. So the 3 types of ADHD is the inattentive type. So they're all called ADHD. They're not called ADD if it's inattentive type. You're just ADHD, and it's inattentive type is what's specified. There is ADHD, your hyperactive and impulsive type. So hyperactivity and impulsivity are combined for the second type of ADHD. The third type of ADHD is combined type, meaning a child or adult is showing signs of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. Wanted to go over common challenges of ADHD. There's a lot of them. Some of them I've already touched on, like hyperactivity, difficulty following directions, time management, self-awareness, the ability to plan, organize, control emotions. Social skills is often something forgotten. Students with ADHD have difficulty with social skills because social skills require paying attention in a conversation, controlling your impulse to interrupt, and you need to be able to pay attention and listen actively when someone's talking. There can be directions incorporated into a social skill or social conversation interaction. You have to organize your thoughts and ask things that as someone's talking, wait to your turn, then ask an appropriate follow-up question before you maybe talk about what you want to talk about. You need to have emotional control in social skill situations. So kids with ADHD often have difficulty with social skills, and people sometimes are like, well, that can't be. ADHD has nothing to do with social skills. That's absolutely not true. Executive functioning and all those skills I just named are very heavily involved with how we interact socially and can be impacted for students with ADHD. So there's some common deficits that are affected cognitively, meaning how our brain works, and academically for ADHD. So attention is one, executive functioning, like I talked about, planning, organizing, navigating our day, being the conductor of our brain if it's an orchestra, like letting the parts of the brain work when it's supposed to and cueing them. Long-term memory or immediate memory, such as working memory, hearing something, storing that information, and then executing it. So that'd be like following 2 to 3 step directions, like in the classroom. Take out your math book, turn to page 57, do problems 1 through 10. A child that with ADHD may hear, take out your math book. They start to take out their math book, and then there's a picture on the front of the math book. Oh my gosh, it's like a circle. That reminds me of pizza. Are we having pizza for lunch today? I'm really, really hungry. Then they've lost their attention and their ability to remember what was next. Long-term memory can be impacted by students with ADHD, as well as processing speed, which is really looking at how quickly and accurately a child can do a task. I always snap my fingers because I feel like when I'm assessing for processing speed, a kid is doing an activity as quick as they can, and it's a simple task that they have to do in a certain amount of time. Reading can be affected by students with ADHD, not just sounding out words through decoding, but reading fluently. Comprehension can be impacted as well. Ability to solve math problems without making careless mistakes. So math calculations, math facts as well, like being able to do multiplication facts, addition, subtraction within a time limit. Written language, writing is a very executive functioning heavy skill. It takes a lot of different things happening at once. It's multitasking. And if you have trouble with multitasking, you're going to have trouble with written language because you're worried about fine motor, you're worried about writing letters legibly, you're worried about what you're going to say, and you're worried about, you're thinking about spelling and punctuation, grammar, lots of things going on with writing. Listening comprehension can also be a bit affected by ADHD. If you're not paying attention, it's hard to comprehend what's going on, as well as oral language. If you're having a hard time with organization, your thoughts may come out disjointed or tangential, meaning all over the place, not really making sense. Executive functioning, I kind of mentioned earlier. Here's my picture. There's your conductor, the front part of the brain, the rest is the orchestra. When we're stressed or when a child feels overwhelmed or in that fight or flight mode, the front part of their brain turns off, which is really hard for students with ADHD because they have a hard time accessing this part of their brain anyways, which might make them more likely to do something impulsive or act without thinking, which can lead to some pretty big consequences. So here are some examples of executive functioning deficits: having difficulty staying seated. They might be unaware of how their actions impact others. They may be resistant to solving a problem in a different way. They get stuck in an activity, have big outbursts or meltdowns, short attention span, had time starting or finishing a task. Forgetting items like homework, personal items like a jacket, a water bottle. This happens to my son a lot at school. Difficulty following a plan or having sloppy or careless errors. Common treatments for ADHD, once diagnosed, is usually therapy and medication in combination. Research shows us that's the best approach. So there are different medications you can take to increase attention and decrease hyperactivity and impulsivity, as well as therapy and interventions that can be done in the classroom or at home. There's cognitive behavior therapy, which is teaching students certain strategies and ways to manage their thoughts. Social skills, obviously, is training students to kind of overcome their obstacles of ADHD to help them navigate the social interaction more fluidly. Family counseling, it's a big deal when someone in the family has a diagnosis of ADHD because it doesn't just affect that one person, it affects everybody in the family. So oftentimes family counseling, I give recommendations for that quite a bit for students with ADHD for the whole family to participate. And often parent support and training is needed. To learn how to support a child at home with ADHD, you need to do some specific things that you wouldn't do for a neurotypical child. And it's okay, it's not something's wrong with them. This is just the way their brain is wired. There's also support groups and specific classroom interventions. Sometimes when you have a child with ADHD or you have ADHD, it can feel very isolating. Support groups can be a fantastic way to help with that. As well as their specific classroom intervention. So some students may qualify for something called a 504 plan, which is accommodations in the classroom like extra time, preferential seating, copies of notes, things like that. Or they may need to be given more support through something called an IEP, individual education plan, which is special education. They need intervention and remediation because their ADHD is affecting them at a level that's beyond what a typical teacher can provide in the classroom. Here are some ADHD strategies. I'm not going to go through all of them because I know I'm just trying to give a brief overview of ADHD and I don't want to overwhelm you. But you can always pause this recording and look at these. Stop there because I go into a lot more detail about teaching students with ADHD and things like that, which I'd be happy to follow up on later. But I know I wanted to give some chunks of helpful information, hopefully, to the moms out there about if you are concerned about if your child might have ADHD and are looking for a diagnosis, what kind of signs to look for, and what are some strategies that you can use if your child already has a diagnosis of ADHD. There's some go-to strategies that I showed you that you can do. I'm also available for free consultations. If you email me at meredith@achieveconcierge.com or follow me on Instagram, Mrs. G, the LEP. I'd be happy to message with you to set up a consultation time and talk about my assessment process and services that are for students with ADHD. I hope this was helpful, and thank you for letting me share this information with you today.